Picture this. One of the most powerful economic zones on Earth, home to 500 million people, some of the world's oldest companies, and centuries of industrial dominance is quietly dying, and the leaders know it. In late 2024, a former central banker published a report so brutally honest, it shattered every polite myth Europe had been telling itself. The diagnosis was clear. Europe isn't unlucky, it's broken by design. The cure, equally clear. But here's the twist. Europe can't take the medicine. Since that report dropped, politicians have announced sweeping reforms, promised deregulation, and pledged to fix everything. Yet behind the PR, almost nothing has changed. The hard choices? Ignored. The real barriers? Still standing. And now the consequences are starting to hit. France is burning through prime ministers. Germany just threw out decades of fiscal discipline. The euro, the currency that was supposed to unite Europe, is tearing it apart instead. So stay with me until the end, because what you're about to see isn't just an economic crisis. It's the slow-motion collapse of a system that forgot how to grow, and the quiet reset that's coming to replace it. Part 1. The report that admitted the unthinkable. Let's rewind to late 2024. A report lands on the desks of European leaders. It's written by Mario Draghi, the guy who once saved the euro with 3 words, whatever it takes. This isn't some random think tank paper. This is the man who ran the European Central Bank telling Europe exactly what's wrong, and he doesn't sugarcoat it. The report says something Europe has spent decades avoiding. The continent isn't just having bad luck. It's not a temporary slump. It's not because of external shocks or unfair competition. Europe is structurally self-inflicted. It has shot itself in the foot, reloaded, and done it again. Here's the core finding that everyone needs to understand. 70% of the gap between European and American living standards comes down to one thing: productivity. Not because Europeans don't work hard, not because of inequality or different lifestyles. It's because Europe produces less value per hour worked. Period. Think about it this way. Imagine 2 workers, one in Ohio, one in Lyon. They both work an 8-hour shift. The American worker generates 15% more economic output in that same time. Not because they're working harder or longer hours, but because the systems around them, the technology, the capital, the infrastructure make them more effective. And here's the kicker. This gap is getting worse, not better. Why does this matter now more than ever? Because Europe is aging, fast. The workforce is shrinking. There are fewer young workers to carry the load and more retirees to support. When your population is getting older and your productivity is stagnant, you're in a doom loop. You need growth to pay for pensions and healthcare, but you can't grow because you're not productive enough. Draghi breaks down the problem into what I'll call 2 iron balls chained to Europe's ankles: energy costs and capital scarcity. Let's start with energy. For years, Europe ran on cheap Russian gas. It powered factories, heated homes, kept costs low. Then Russia invaded Ukraine. Gas supplies got cut off. Prices exploded. Germany, Europe's industrial powerhouse, decided to shut down its remaining nuclear power plants at the exact same time. You couldn't script a worse policy if you were actively trying to destroy your own economy. The result? Energy costs in Europe are now permanently higher than in the United States or Asia. If you're a steel manufacturer, a chemical plant, or any heavy industry, you're paying double or triple what your competitors pay. That's not a temporary crisis. That's a permanent competitive disadvantage. It's like running a marathon with an iron ball tied to your ankle. You can still run, but you'll never win. Now, let's talk about the second iron ball: capital scarcity. This one's more subtle, but just as deadly. In Europe, venture capital, the money that funds startups and innovation, is practically non-existent compared to the United States. As a share of GDP, venture capital investment in Europe is 5 times lower than in America. 5 times. What does that mean in practice? A European startup gets 80% less funding than an American one at the same stage. 80%. So if you're a brilliant entrepreneur in Berlin or Paris with a breakthrough idea, you're fighting with one hand tied behind your back. You either stay small or you leave. And they do leave. Since 2008, a third of Europe's most promising startups, the so-called unicorns, have relocated to the US or other markets where they can actually scale. Here's the most damning statistic. The average age of Europe's 5 largest companies is close to 100 years. Volkswagen, Siemens, Nestlé, giants from the industrial age. Meanwhile, in America, the 5 biggest companies, Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, Meta, average under 40 years old. Not a single European company worth more than 100 billion euros has been built from scratch in the last 50 years. Not one. That tells you everything. Europe is living off the success of the past. It's not building the future. And here's why Draghi's diagnosis matters more now than it did even a year ago. Every single one of these problems has gotten worse. The energy shock isn't reversing. The venture capital gap is widening. The demographic decline is accelerating. The global competition from the US, from China, from emerging tech hubs is intensifying. Europe finally has an honest diagnosis. The question is, can it actually do what's required to fix it? Spoiler alert, no. And that's where things get really interesting. Part 2. The illusion of reform, the competitiveness compass. So the Draghi report drops. Europe's leaders read it. They nod seriously. They give speeches. And in January 2025, the European Union announces its official response, the competitiveness compass. On paper, it sounds great. Brussels claims it's 90% inspired by Draghi. They promise sweeping deregulation, cutting red tape, reviving innovation, fixing the single market once and for all. 33 initiatives, they say, half already approved. The goal? Close the innovation gap with the United States in AI, quantum tech, robotics, biotech. Put Europe back on the technological frontier. And honestly, the mere fact that European politicians are admitting this gap exists is progress. For years, the official line was, Europe doesn't need its own Google, or we compete differently. Now they're at least acknowledging reality. But here's where the theatre begins. Because when you dig into what's actually being implemented, you realise they're doing the easy stuff and ignoring the hard stuff. They're reforming what looks modern, not what actually matters. Let's use one example to show how this works. The GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. You know that annoying cookie banner that pops up on every website asking you to accept or reject tracking? Yeah, that's the GDPR in action. Now, the GDPR was sold as a way to protect consumer privacy. Noble goal, but in practice, it became a massive self-inflicted wound. Storing data in Europe now costs 20% more than in the US, just because of regulatory compliance. 20%. For tech startups, those costs eat up between 4 and 11% of total jobs. And that's before you count the investment that never happens in the first place. One study found that the GDPR cost the EU more than $1.5 billion per year in lost investment, with American investors pulling back the hardest. Why? Because if you're a venture capitalist in Silicon Valley deciding where to put your money, why would you invest in a market where compliance costs are sky high and enforcement is unpredictable? And here's the absurd part. The GDPR eats up to 12% of tech companies' revenues, especially smaller ones that don't have armies of lawyers to navigate the bureaucracy. Larger companies like Google or Meta, they can afford compliance teams. Startups, they get crushed. So when the competitiveness compass was announced, one of the headline reforms was, "We're finally fixing the GDPR, no more cookie banners." Champagne all around, right? Not quite. When you read the fine print, what they're actually proposing isn't to eliminate the system. It's to create a narrow exception for a very specific type of data. The rest? Europeans will still see cookie banners on 99% of websites. And even those exceptions might not actually apply in practice. Because European regulators have a habit of interpreting laws in the most restrictive way possible. The problem isn't just the laws themselves, it's the layers of bureaucracy that surround them. There are so many commissions, specialised courts and enforcement agencies that you'll always find one that blocks reform. Even when a law technically changes, the enforcement culture doesn't. This is the pattern across the entire competitiveness compass. Rhetoric versus reality. They announce sweeping reforms. They count up dozens of policy changes. But when you look at which ones actually get implemented, it's the symbolic stuff. The things that let politicians say we're doing something without taking real political risk. Deutsche Bank put it bluntly, no policy has been approved nor is expected to be approved that would bring about a real change in the situation. Nothing that would actually change the rules of the game. Take mergers and acquisitions. Draghi said Europe needs to let companies consolidate, get bigger and compete globally. The response? The Competition Commissioner was tasked with preparing a roadmap to improve merger rules. Deadline 2027. And it won't even be a law, it's just an analysis. An analysis in 2 years. Or take the boast that these reforms will save companies between 6 and 9 billion euros. Sounds impressive, right? Until you realise that amount covers about 15 days of pension payments in Spain. 15 days. It's a rounding error. The Draghi report was a step in the right direction because it was finally honest. But it wasn't perfect, because it avoided anything that would create political conflict. Everything had to be win-win. If a policy meant someone had to lose, it was off the table. The best example? Environmental policy. Draghi acknowledges that sky-high carbon taxes have wrecked Europe's industrial base. The solution in the report? Keep going and hope technology catches up. It's a the worse the better approach. Push prices so high that they force innovation. Maybe. Someday. There's no mention of labour reform like making it easier to lay off workers to promote business dynamism. That's political suicide. Even the parties sceptical of green policies don't openly acknowledge these trade-offs in Parliament. Nobody wants to be the one who says, yes, it'll be easier for your boss to fire you, but don't worry, we'll have a great safety net. Europe knows what needs to be done, but it can't do it. Because every real reform creates losers, and in European politics, losers have veto power. Which brings us to the even bigger problem. Europe can't even implement the easy reforms. Part 3. The core failure, a market that isn't one. Let's shift from regulation to structure. Because the real growth killer isn't just red tape, it's that Europe's so-called single market isn't actually single. In theory, the European Union is one giant market. Goods, services, people and capital can move freely across borders. In practice, it's 27 separate markets duct-taped together, each with its own rules, taxes and protectionist lobbies. Here's how bad it is. The effective internal tariffs, meaning the cost of regulatory barriers, are about 40% on goods and 100% on services. 100%. That means it's twice as expensive to sell a service across an EU border as it is to sell it domestically, even though there's supposedly no border. Think about that. Europe spends decades lecturing the world about free trade and open markets. But inside its own borders, it has trade barriers worse than Donald Trump's wildest tariff fantasies. And here's why this matters more than external protectionism. It blocks scale before firms even go global. If you're a company in Italy and you want to expand to France, you face so many regulatory hoops that it's often not worth it. So you stay small, you stay regional, you never reach the size needed to compete with American or Chinese giants. The political economy behind this is depressingly simple. Small national lobbies block reforms that would benefit 99% of Europeans. A taxi union in Paris doesn't want competition from ride-sharing apps. A pharmacy association in Germany doesn't want online competition. Local trucking companies don't want open borders for freight. Each veto is narrow, but together they paralyse the entire system. And the proof? Intra-EU trade between European countries, has fallen from 26% of GDP to 23%. It's going backward. Despite all the talk of integration, European countries are trading less with each other, not more. So what's Brussels doing about this? They're throwing money at it. There's the Horizon programme for research and development, the Innovation Fund, billions of euros in grants and subsidies. Sounds good, right? Except the programmes are designed to avoid controversy, which means they accomplish nothing. One of the big improvements announced was cutting the time it takes for a researcher to get a grant from 8 months to 7 months. 7 months, 1 month faster, break out the champagne, and even those timelines are optimistic. There's already talk that the next framework programme, FP10, will see its budget cut from 175 billion euros to less than 140 billion. They announce big numbers at the start, then quietly slash them later when the bills come due. But the real problem isn't how much they spend, it's how they spend it. Draghi recommended that the EU directly fund a handful of elite universities to push them into the global top 10, make them world-class, concentrate resources, build genuine centres of excellence. Has that happened? No, because it's politically impossible. Imagine German politicians voting to funnel money into a French university, or Spanish taxpayers subsidising a Dutch research lab. Every country wants its share. So the money gets spread thin, and nobody wins. This is why there's no European Wall Street, no unified capital market. European savings, 10 trillion euros sitting in bank accounts, can't move efficiently. According to Deutsche Bank, mobilizing just 10% of that savings would free up 400 billion euros in investment. But it doesn't happen, because each country wants to control its own financial system. And here's the cruel irony. Europe has the capital. It's just paralyzed. The money exists, but the political system prevents it from flowing to where it's needed. This isn't poverty, it's paralysis. Part 4. The engines stall. France, Germany, and the broken euro. Now let's talk about how this theoretical crisis becomes a real balance sheet, sovereign debt disaster. France and Germany are the twin engines of Europe. When they're running smoothly, the whole system works. When they malfunction, everything breaks. And right now, both engines are on fire, but in completely opposite ways. Let's start with France. In the past year, France has burned through 4 prime ministers. 4. The government is in chaos. The deficit is at 6% of GDP, double the EU limit. Debt is heading toward 120% of GDP. And here's the kicker. New borrowing isn't funding investment or growth. It's just refinancing old debt. France's 10-year bond now yields about 3.5%. The 30-year, over 4.3%. That's 8 times higher than during the COVID era. In October 2024, one prime minister lasted 14 hours in office. Fitch downgraded France's credit rating, citing deep political paralysis. Meanwhile, Germany, the poster child of fiscal discipline, the land of the black zero budget, just tore up its own rulebook. After Trump's foreign policy shake-up and the Valentine's Day security breakdown, Berlin scrapped its debt brake and pushed through a €1 trillion stimulus, rearmament, infrastructure, everything. After decades of forcing austerity on everyone else, Germany gave itself permission to borrow at will. So here's the problem. France and Germany need opposite things. France needs low interest rates to manage its debt. Germany needs higher rates to avoid inflation from its stimulus. But they share the same currency, the euro, and the European Central Bank can only set one interest rate. This is what economists call monetary disunity. Officially, the euro still exists. But in practice, monetary unity is dead. The ECB is trapped. If it raises rates to fight inflation, France collapses under its debt burden. If it keeps rates low to save France, Germany gets runaway inflation. There's only one mathematical solution: sustained inflation. 6 to 7% for over a decade. That's what it would take to inflate away France's debt and bring it back to manageable levels. But that's politically impossible. Why should German savers get their wealth destroyed to pay for French spending? So what's quietly happening instead? Power is shifting back to national governments. Each country is starting to direct credit, telling banks where to lend, guaranteeing loans, funneling money into preferred sectors. In Spain and Italy, almost 100% of corporate loan growth is state-backed. Pension funds are being nudged, or let's be honest, cornered, into buying domestic government bonds at politically convenient rates. Berlin will set the German yield curve. Paris will set the French one, monetary union in name only. This is what economic historian Russell Napier calls financial repression. It's a quiet return to state-directed credit, where governments decide who gets funding and savers foot the bill. And it's not theory, it's happening right now. The euro still exists on paper, but the system that was supposed to unite Europe is now tearing it apart. Part 5. Valentine's Day, 2025. The geopolitical divorce. And just when Europe's internal crisis hits peak chaos, the final shock arrives from across the Atlantic. February 14th, 2025. Valentine's Day. But instead of love, Europe gets a breakup letter. At the Munich Security Conference, US Vice President J.D. Vance delivers a message that shatters 80 years of transatlantic alliance. The partnership can no longer be taken for granted. America's priority isn't defending Europe anymore, it's fighting cultural battles at home. To drive the point home, Vance refuses to meet the German Chancellor. Instead, he sits down with the leader of the AfD, Germany's far-right party. The signal is unmistakable. The US doesn't care about Europe's internal politics. It sees the continent as a burden, not a partner. Leaked group chats later make it even worse. Vance and his defense secretary reportedly said they hate bailing Europe out again, and called European allies freeloading and pathetic. For Europe, this is existential. The security guarantee that anchored the continent since World War II, the assumption that America would always be there, is gone. Europe is on its own. And here's the timing. This happens while Europe is already in fiscal crisis, monetary disarray and political chaos. Now add the cost of rearming, modernising militaries, building defence industries from scratch, all while bond yields are rising, deficits are exploding and voters are furious. It's like being told you need to run a marathon, remodel your house, and pay off your credit cards, all at the same time with no income. The geopolitical divorce accelerates capital flight. Investors look at Europe and see instability, fragmentation, and no security backstop. Money flows out. Bond spreads widen. The crisis deepens. When growth fails and allies leave, there's only one tool left: control. Part 6. The reset. Control masquerading as stability. So let's talk about how Europe plans to avoid collapse. Because the answer isn't growth, it's control. The first lever is the Savings and Investment Union, the SIU. Officially, it's about helping Europeans invest their savings instead of leaving them in bank accounts. Sounds helpful, right? Here's the reality. The EU wants to funnel 10 trillion euros in household savings into EU-aligned assets. Not through confiscation, at least not yet, but through auto-enrolment. Your pension? Quietly redirected into funds managed by institutions like BlackRock, whose mandates align with Brussels' agenda. Retail investors are being encouraged to put life savings into a liquid small and medium-sized enterprises, startups that might fail, and if they do, Brussels disclaims all liability. You lose money, don't come complaining. The goal isn't to help you, it's to trap capital inside the system and direct it toward government priorities. But when the carrot doesn't work, they reach for the stick, the digital euro. The European Central Bank is pushing hard to launch a central bank digital currency, a CBDC. Officially, it's to compete with dollar-backed stablecoins. In reality, it's about control. Augustin Carstens, head of the Bank for International Settlements, said the quiet part out loud. Central banks will have absolute control over how CBDCs are used, spending caps, holding limits, and here's the big one: negative interest rates applied directly to your account. Think about that. With physical cash, you can at least hide it under your mattress. With a digital euro, the ECB could literally delete a portion of your balance unless you spend it or invest it in approved assets, like green bonds. To keep up appearances, the ECB is rebranding this as conditional payments and outsourcing enforcement to commercial banks. But since those banks answer to the ECB, the control stays centralized. This is financial repression in digital form. It's silent, it's legal, and it's gradual, but it reshapes behavior, not just balance sheets. The humanitarian cost? Middle-class savers, pensioners, and young workers absorb it all. Your savings lose value, your pension gets redirected, your spending gets monitored and controlled. Europe doesn't collapse loudly, it tightens quietly. Part 7. Doomed or cornered? So here's where we are. Correct diagnosis, failed execution, forced control. Europe's decline isn't sudden, it's slow, political, and deeply social. Stagnation becomes the new normal. Emigration accelerates. Millions of talented young people leave for better opportunities. Populism surges as voters demand answers the establishment can't provide. Intergenerational tension explodes as young workers realize they're funding a system that won't be there for them. From a market's perspective, returns are no longer earned through competition, they're assigned through policy. The winners are companies aligned with government spending priorities, defense contractors, green energy firms, infrastructure builders. The losers are legacy financial firms, private equity, anything built on leverage and yield extraction. If you're holding gold or Bitcoin, self-custody is everything. ETFs and custodial wallets won't protect you, they'll just make you easier to control. But beyond markets, something bigger is shifting. The age of a unified, Western-led Europe is fading. Populations demand tighter immigration policies, pragmatic energy plans, fewer ideological crusades. European leaders are already softening their stance toward China and other emerging powers. The geopolitical centre of gravity is tilting eastward. The transatlantic alliance is fractured. The European project is faltering. Washington's volatility makes long-term partnership impossible. If the US isn't holding Europe together anymore, maybe no one will. So is Europe doomed, or just cornered? That's the open question, Draghi warned early. But Europe waited too long. The reforms that could have saved it were never implemented. Now the choice is between collapse or control, and Europe has chosen control. This isn't the end, it's the beginning of the reset. The question is, will it bring reform or ruin?